I was 24 when this happened. I'd finished college maybe 4 or 5 months earlier and was doing landscaping work because I still hadn't figured out what I wanted long term. My cousin Ryan was older than me by about 8 years and worked HVAC. We usually tried to do at least one fishing trip together every year if our schedules lined up. This was around early October of 2018, I think. We went to Allegheny National Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania for a weekend camping trip. Ryan knew about a creek out there that supposedly had good trout fishing. Since summer was over by then, the trails were quieter. I mostly remember the drive up. It rained almost the whole time. Just cold, steady rain, not a storm or anything. We stopped at a Sheetz outside Warren and grabbed sandwiches and coffee before heading farther into the forest roads. By the time we parked and started hiking in, it was late afternoon. Everything was wet from the rain earlier. We packed pretty light since we had to carry everything a few miles. Tent, fishing gear, cooler, food. Nothing unusual at first. About an hour into the hike, Ryan pointed at tire tracks in the mud ahead of us. There'd been a sign earlier saying vehicles weren't allowed past a certain point, so somebody had ignored it. Ryan said, "Probably hunters." I remember noticing the tracks looked fresh because rainwater hadn't settled into them yet. But people ignore park rules all the time, so we didn't think much about it. We found a decent spot near the creek before it got dark and started setting up camp. Ryan handled the fire while I got our fishing stuff together for the morning. A little later, we walked downstream looking for a better fishing spot, and that's when we found the lantern. It was sitting beside the creek, already lit. There was one of those folding camping chairs next to it, facing the water. No tent nearby, no cooler, no backpack. Nothing. At first, I figured somebody had stepped away for a minute, maybe gathering firewood or using the bathroom. But we stood there looking around for a while and couldn't find any sign of a campsite nearby. Ryan called out once. Nobody answered. The creek was loud enough that maybe somebody farther away wouldn't have heard us. That was kind of what we settled on. Ryan shrugged and said, "Not our business." So we walked back to camp. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Looking back, it's probably the first thing that should have made us leave. The rest of the night was normal for a while. We heated canned chili over the fire and talked about family stuff and work. Around 10 or so, we got into the tent because it started getting pretty cold. I woke up later hearing Ryan unzip the tent door. I asked what he was doing. He said, "Cooler's over there." I thought an animal had dragged it away. But when I got outside with my flashlight, the cooler was sitting upright near a tree maybe 20 feet from camp. Closed, nothing missing. Ryan walked around a little with the flashlight and said maybe a raccoon moved it somehow, but it didn't really make sense. There weren't any marks in the mud from it being dragged. It looked set down there. We carried it back and got back in the tent. I don't know how much later it was when I started hearing the whistling. At first, I thought it might have been part of a dream because it was faint and spaced out. Just short whistles every so often somewhere in the woods. Not music or anything recognizable. Just random whistles. After one of them, Ryan quietly said, "You hear that?" I said, "Yeah." Neither of us said much after that. The whistling kept happening every few minutes. Sometimes it sounded farther away, then closer again. Or maybe it wasn't moving at all and it just sounded different depending on the direction. Eventually, Ryan said it was probably another camper. That explanation made enough sense to me at the time. Then the whistling stopped. A few minutes later, we heard footsteps outside the tent. Slow footsteps moving around us through wet leaves and mud. Not running, just walking. I remember they'd stop for a few seconds at a time, then start again somewhere else around the tent. Ryan finally raised his voice and said, "Hey, you good out there?" The footsteps stopped right away. No answer. Nothing after that. We stayed awake for a while, listening for more movement. Every small noise outside got our attention after that. Branches moving, leaves shifting around, stuff like that. At some point, we both fell asleep again. As soon as daylight started coming through the tent, Ryan said, "Let's just pack up." I agreed immediately. We packed everything pretty quickly and carried it back toward the parking area. When we got there, I noticed my driver's side door wasn't shut all the way, just slightly open. I knew I'd locked it because Ryan had joked the night before that I checked it twice. At first, it didn't seem like anything was missing. Then I saw my wallet sitting open on the passenger seat. Cash was still there, cards too. But my driver's license was gone. That part honestly confused me more than anything else. If somebody was stealing from the car, why only take that? Ryan had been loading gear into the truck when he suddenly stopped and looked toward the woods across the parking area. There was a guy standing there partly behind a tree, maybe 50 yards away. Dark rain jacket with the hood up, just watching us. I couldn't see his face clearly from that distance. Ryan yelled, "Hey!" The guy turned and walked back into the woods without saying anything. Ryan started walking after him for maybe a second before I told him to leave it alone. We finished loading up and left pretty fast after that. On the way out, we stopped at a ranger station and told them what happened. The ranger asked where we'd camped and whether we saw any vehicles past the restricted trail area. He mentioned they'd had issues with illegal hunters staying out there sometimes. Nothing ever came from the report, though. I replaced my license a few days later. But for a while after that, anytime somebody knocked unexpectedly at my apartment, I'd think about the fact my address had been on it. Ryan stopped doing isolated camping trips after that, and we never went back to that area again. I still don't understand why somebody would take only my ID and leave everything else behind. That's the part I've never come up with a good explanation for. And I still think about that lantern sometimes too, because whoever left it there was probably somewhere nearby the whole time. There's a trail in Olympic National Forest that my friend Melissa and I used to hike around Thanksgiving break every year. We both work in schools, so we usually had the same time off, and neither of us liked hiking during summer when everything was crowded. This happened maybe 3 years ago. Late November, cold out, but not snowing yet. The weather was pretty normal for western Washington. Wet ground, fog in some areas, everything damp. I picked Melissa up around noon, and we stopped at a grocery store outside Port Angeles before heading to the trail. I bought one of those packaged turkey sandwiches because we figured we'd eat while walking. We'd been on that trail enough times that we barely looked at the map anymore. It wasn't a difficult hike, just a long trail through the woods with an old fire tower near the upper section. The tower had supposedly been closed for years. The parking lot only had 2 other cars when we got there, which wasn't unusual that time of year. Most people stopped going up there once the weather got colder. The first part of the hike was normal. Muddy in some places, but nothing bad. Melissa spent most of the time talking about one of her students ruining a classroom rug with permanent marker. Just regular stuff. About halfway up the trail, we crossed a small stream, and that's where we noticed the cigarette butts. There were several of them near the rocks by the water. That wasn't really strange by itself. People leave trash everywhere. But they looked fresh. It had rained earlier that morning, and the cigarette filters were still dry. Melissa pointed at them and said, "Someone's up here." I figured another hiker had stopped there recently. So we kept going. The fog got a little thicker higher up the trail. You could still see fine, but the trees farther away looked faded out. When we reached the fire tower, the metal door at the bottom was partly open. Maybe a foot or so. We both stopped for a second. Every other time we'd been there, it had been locked. There were signs warning people not to enter because of safety issues. Melissa kind of laughed and said, "Maybe they forgot to lock it." I said, "Maybe." But honestly, I didn't really think that was the reason. We walked over anyway. As soon as we stepped inside, I noticed there was stuff sitting around the stairwell. Blankets, soup cans, water jugs, batteries stacked against the wall. There was a small camping stove sitting near the stairs, too. It didn't look abandoned either. It looked like somebody had been there recently. Melissa quietly said, "Okay, someone's staying here." I remember feeling like we shouldn't even be standing there anymore. Like we'd walked into somebody's place by accident. We didn't go farther up the tower. We were already turning around to leave when we heard a scraping sound somewhere above us. Metal scraping across metal. Then it happened again. It sounded like somebody dragging something across the floor overhead. Neither of us moved for a second. Then Melissa said, "Let's go." We left right after that. Neither of us called out or asked if someone was up there. Maybe we should have, I don't know. I just wanted to get back down the trail. The hike back was quieter. We still talked some, but mostly about random things, work stuff, holiday plans. I think both of us were trying not to make a bigger deal out of it. At one point, I noticed another cigarette butt near a fallen log farther down the trail. Same brand as the others, I think. By the time we got back to the car, it was starting to get dark. Those roads out there are mostly narrow Forest Service roads, and there usually aren't many cars once you get away from the trailheads. About 10 minutes into the drive back, I noticed an older white pickup behind us. At first, I didn't think much of it. There are a lot of trucks out there. But after a while, I noticed it stayed close behind me the entire time. Whenever I slowed down for curves, it slowed down too. Melissa noticed it before I mentioned anything. "That truck's still behind us." I said, "Yeah." I still thought maybe it was nothing. Then I turned onto a smaller road because there was a viewpoint Melissa liked nearby. The truck turned too. A few minutes later, I took another road that basically only led to an old maintenance gate. The truck followed us there too. Neither of us talked much after that. I turned around and headed back toward the highway. The truck stayed behind us the whole way. Finally, I pulled into a small gas station near the edge of town. The truck pulled in too. It parked across the lot but didn't go to a pump. Melissa was looking through the windshield for a few seconds before she said, "Look at the truck bed." There was a dark green blanket underneath some tools in the back. It looked a lot like one of the blankets from the tower. I know that probably sounds minor, and maybe it was. Blankets are blankets, but both of us noticed it right away. The guy in the truck never got out. He just sat there. We went inside the gas station and stayed there for probably 20 minutes, pretending to look around while checking outside every so often. Eventually, the truck left. We waited a little longer before leaving too. When we got back onto the highway, Melissa pointed farther up the road. The same truck was parked on the shoulder facing traffic. Not pulled over like it broke down. Just parked there. I didn't say anything. I just turned the opposite direction from home and drove toward a busier area instead. The truck never followed us again after that. A couple days later, I submitted a report through the Park Service website about someone possibly staying in the fire tower. I never heard anything back. Melissa told me later she thought the person upstairs had probably heard us the entire time we were inside. Maybe she was right. I still think about it sometimes because we never actually saw anyone up there. Just signs that somebody was... This happened the summer before my younger brother got deployed overseas. He was 22 then, and I was 28. I worked at an auto shop outside Little Rock, and he'd been home maybe a month before leaving again. He wanted to do one more camping trip before deployment. Nothing big, just a weekend in the Ozarks with his friend Evan, who he'd known forever. It was mid-July and humid as hell. The second you stepped out of the truck, your shirt stuck to you. We drove up Friday afternoon in my Tacoma with all the camping gear thrown in the back under a tarp. I remember stopping at a gas station outside Clarksville because Tyler wanted sunflower seeds and beef jerky. Evan bought one of those giant energy drinks that smell like melted candy. Normal drive, nothing unusual. The campsite itself was pretty isolated. You had to take a dirt road for several miles, then another smaller road off that. Tyler found the spot online somewhere. When we pulled in, I noticed another campsite off through the trees, maybe a quarter mile away. Nobody was there, but the fire pit still had smoke coming off it. Not flames, just warm ash. Tyler yelled, "Hello?" Mostly just to be polite, but nobody answered. We figured whoever was there had gone hiking or something. The rest of the afternoon was normal. We set up tents, cooked burgers, sat around talking. Evan kept trying to convince Tyler not to re-enlist after his contract ended. After it got dark, things got quieter except for bugs and branches moving once in a while. Around 10 or 11 that night, we started hearing what sounded like a generator somewhere deeper in the woods. It would run for a little while, stop, then start again a few minutes later. Tyler joked, "Breaking Bad setup." Evan laughed. I didn't think much about it at first. People do weird stuff out there, hunting camps, makeshift cabins, whatever. But the sound kept coming and going. Not close enough to figure out exactly where it was. At one point, I remember standing up from the fire trying to listen better, but the generator shut off again before I could place it. Eventually, we all turned in. I woke up sometime after midnight to use the bathroom. The fire had mostly burned out by then. While I was standing near the edge of camp, I noticed flashlight beams moving through the trees farther out. Not pointed at us, just moving around between the trees. At first I assumed it was the people from the other campsite. But whenever I aimed my flashlight in that direction, their lights disappeared. Not instantly. More like whoever had them turned away or shut them off. I didn't mention it to Tyler or Evan. I probably should have, but I figured there was a normal explanation and went back to sleep. The next morning, Tyler was already awake. I could hear him outside moving around while Evan was still asleep in his tent. A few minutes later, Tyler yelled, "Hey, come here." He was standing behind our campsite near a patch of loose dirt covered with branches and leaves. It looked like somebody had dug there recently and tried covering it back up. Tyler had already scraped part of it open with a stick. There were black trash bags underneath. Several of them. At first I thought maybe somebody dumped garbage out there. People do that all the time in remote areas. But one of the bags had a tear near the bottom, and there was a smell coming out of it. Not normal trash. Way worse than that. Tyler stepped back right away and said, "Nope." Evan walked over asking what we found, and none of us touched the bags after that. I remember there were flies all around the torn part once we got closer. We spent a few minutes arguing about what to do because cell service barely worked out there. Tyler managed to get maybe one bar standing on a rock near camp, but every call dropped. Finally, we decided to drive out and find a ranger station. It took longer than I expected because the roads were rough and easy to miss turns on. We eventually found a small ranger office, maybe 30 or 40 minutes away. The ranger there was older, probably late 50s. He looked annoyed at first because we walked in all talking over each other. Then Tyler mentioned buried trash bags behind our campsite. The ranger's whole attitude changed. He asked exactly where the campsite was and whether we touched anything. Tyler said no. The ranger grabbed his keys and told us to take him there. The drive back was quiet. Evan tried joking around once or twice, but nobody really responded. When we got back, the ranger walked behind the campsite with Tyler while I stayed near the truck. He looked at the dirt for maybe 10 seconds. Then he came back and said, "Pack your stuff up, now." I asked if he needed help with anything. He just said, "No, leave it alone." Not angry, just serious. We started throwing everything into the truck without really packing it properly. Sleeping bags, chairs, coolers, all of it just shoved in the back. Nobody really discussed why we were rushing. We just started moving faster. While we were packing, we heard an ATV somewhere up the dirt road leading toward camp. A muddy four-wheeler rolled slowly past the entrance carrying two guys in hunting clothes. Camo jackets, baseball caps, mud all over the tires. The ATV slowed down when they saw us loading the truck. Neither guy said anything. One of them kept staring at Tyler while they passed. Then they kept driving. The ranger came back from behind camp a minute later, and I mentioned the ATV. He immediately asked, "How many?" I said 2. A few minutes after that, another ranger vehicle came flying down the road way faster than anybody normally drives out there. The older ranger talked quietly with the other one for maybe half a minute. I couldn't hear most of it. Then he walked over and said, "You guys need to leave." Tyler asked, "What's in the bags?" The ranger shook his head and said, "Get to the highway first." So we left. A couple weeks later, Tyler sent me a local article mentioning illegal dumping and poaching somewhere in that part of the forest. There weren't many details. Maybe the bags really were animal remains from illegal hunting. That's probably the most likely explanation. Still, the ranger's reaction made it seem worse than that. And I still think about those guys on the ATV sometimes. Mostly because of how slowly they drove past our campsite. Like they were checking whether we'd seen something we weren't supposed to.